to me with your whole heart, for I am gracious and merciful. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, but early in the morning he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him. And he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, so they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he bent down and wrote on the ground, and in response they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Please be seated. Can you believe it? Only 2 more weeks left of Lent before Easter. Now we know the Lenten season is very important. It's a time for us to take a very close look at ourselves, to accept our gifts, our abilities, and even our limitations, to acknowledge our sins, and to recognize our need for redemption. And above all, not to pass judgment on others, but rather to take a deep look within ourselves. In the gospel reading today, we heard about the scribes and the Pharisees bringing this woman that had been caught in adultery to Jesus. Now, it's pretty obvious that the scribes and Pharisees, they had already passed judgment on this woman. They were just bringing her to Jesus to set him up. They knew that if Jesus said to stone her, that he would be in violation of Roman law. If he said to forgive her, he'd be in violation of Jewish law. I can just imagine how giddy they must have been feeling, "We got him this time. There's no way out." So what did Jesus do? Well, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he bent down and started scribbling in the sand. And this was a very common practice back in those days, for especially men to do, when they were in a confrontational type of situation, and they wanted to collect their thoughts before they spoke. It was like us counting to 10 today. And then Jesus got up, and his words were just so simple, yet so profound, when he basically said, "Let he who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone." Well, in just those few words, he turned the tables completely around on those scribes and Pharisees. He had to just take the wind right out of their sails. And so what did they do? They just slinked away. And then Jesus turned to the woman and he said, "Has no one condemned you?" And she basically said, "No, sir, they all left." And he said, "Well, neither do I condemn you." Then he told the woman, "Go and sin no more." Now, when you first hear this, you might think that Jesus was giving this lady a command or an order. Go, sin no more. But when you read it more in depth, It's more like a request. It's as if Jesus was saying, I have forgiven you. So when you leave here today, do your best not to commit any more sins. But here's the lifeline he gave her. Just in case, remember that I will always be here for you. And that's what Jesus is telling all of us today. Just in case, he will always be here for us. And this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. But it's ironic, though, that this very passage disappeared for a while from the early manuscripts of the Bible. Can you shut that door, please? Thank you. But why? It's authentic, and that's the point. It was too authentic in proclaiming Jesus' teaching of love and forgiveness. That's because the early Christians just weren't quite on board with this, what they considered this soft approach by Jesus. You see, they were trying to enact firm discipline on their new faith communities. And Jesus, he just made it sound too easy. And this approach by Jesus, many of the early Christians took it to mean that Jesus was implying, commit a sin, be forgiven, and you're free to sin again. But they forgot to factor in, that's what they forgot to factor in, was Jesus' teaching of love. Jesus knew that love could break this pattern. Sure, punishment had its value, but nothing was as successful in reforming a person as for that person to truly feel that someone believed in them and that they were worthy of love. And we hear from the Gospels that Jesus always preached and practiced forgiveness and asked other people to do so also. But we mustn't get forgiving and forgetting mixed up. We've all heard the expression forgive and forget, right? For God, that's easy to do. It's like he takes that, that Mr. Clean sponge and just wipes away the stain of sin. But for us, it's not quite that easy. Sure, we can take that same sponge and wipe away. But the difference is, many times, we humans remember where that stain was. So my request to all of us today is that we truly try to be like Jesus. And as the old saying goes, let bygones be bygones, and be willing to forgive and forget, especially on these last days of Lent. We ask that we can rejoice with our risen Savior on Easter morning. Please stand.